part of what keeps people sane is healthy social dynamic and the ability to pay attention to cues. And that might be particularly true for children. I was reading a book the other day. I unfortunately don't remember the name of it. I didn't read much of it, but it was written by an anthropologist who spent some time in more tribal societies watching how they raised children. Well, in some sense, they didn't. The children went off and played.
Mm-hmm.
And so they socialized each other. And that's a good example of how sanity emerges from social interactions.
Are you implying that that's better, that dynamic is better? I know that your thoughts on raising children include like, as few rules as possible, as little discipline as possible, which seems
now,
like...
I wouldn't say as little discipline, but rules.
Okay.
There's a good rule for rules, which is don't multiply rules beyond necessity, because bad rules drive out respect for good rules. And the cost of a rule is enforcement. So every time you add a rule, well, you add the necessity of enforcement.
Sure.
So there are minimal, you want a minimal set of necessary rules, and then you need to enforce them. But generally, children socialize each other. There's very good evidence for that, apart from this book, which, as I said, I had just begun to read. Children who are aggressive at 2. Mm-hmm. So there's a subset of children who are quite aggressive at 2. They are aggressive by nature, by all appearances. Most of them are socialized by the age of 4. And if they're socialized by then, they develop peer relationships that are strong, and then that carries them along, their peer relationships. So in some sense, the job of a parent is to socialize children well enough so that they can have friends.
How do you do that?
Well, one of the rules I laid out in the first book I wrote was don't let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. And that's, I suppose, part of self-awareness. I mean, you might say, well, I'd never dislike my child. It's like, yeah, right. Come on. Now, that doesn't mean you don't love them. Although, now and then you might feel that you don't love them too. But certainly you're going to dislike them momentarily for things that they're doing or not doing. Well, if you don't like them, what makes you think someone else will? And then you might say, well, that's just me. That's just you. You're just one person. Well, you're the closest thing to a representative of the social community that they have, so they're stuck with you. And then I would also say, well, it'd probably be better if there were 2 of you, father and a mother, because then you can try to make sure that both of you add up to one sane person so the child can interact with that one sane person. But, it's definitely the case that, I've seen children who don't have anyone to play with because they don't know how to play. They're not socialized. It's horrible. And they fall farther and farther behind all the time because...
Yeah. Do you think that falls on, is that a parent thing? Is that maybe being in a household of, not having a mom and a dad there?
Children who are fatherless do worse. There's no doubt about that. And no one likes to say that, but the research evidence is crystal clear. And it's hardly surprising. I don't know why anyone would find that surprising. First of all, it's too much work to raise children by yourself, especially if you have to work. So in that case, you're not going to raise them by yourself anyways. You're going to have other people help you. But, it's likely the case that the nuclear family is the minimum necessary social arrangement for raising children. And it's possibly not sufficient. We also don't know what's happened to children because they don't have very many siblings anymore. And siblings really, in some sense, socialize you. They certainly help take the narcissism out of you. Right, because siblings, they don't let each other get away with being narcissistic, essentially. They're very, very unhappy about special attention. So we don't know how many children have to have around in order to be socialized properly. But I suspect we're erring on the side of not enough now, and probably not enough for parents.
Does it seems, but is it the case that narcissism is becoming more and more and more common?
I really don't know. It's very, very difficult to answer questions like that because we just don't have reliable measures across generations.
Right.
You know, it isn't obvious to me that young people today are more narcissistic than young people were in the 60s. So, you know, it wasn't obvious to me when I was teaching university that the students were more narcissistic than they were when I started teaching.
Mm-hmm.
But like I said, fundamentally, it's hard to get an accurate measure of something like narcissism and then to track it over decades. You don't even know if the measure itself shifts.
Sure.
I do believe that that people are more lonesome than they were. They're more socially isolated, but you know, that's also very difficult to determine. Yeah, I'm loath to make intergenerational comparisons, you know, because
Sure.
every generation thinks that this current young generation is worse than any generation that's ever existed. And it's
like
just,
when you grow up and you listen to your parents listen to your music and they're like, this stuff's awful. And then that continues on every generation. Like that stuff's awful that the kids are listening to. It's like, no matter what, there's always this idea that, oh, it's the worst than ever. And so maybe that leads to that question, which is, what is better and what is worse than ever right now in our culture?
I guess it depends to some degree on your scale. So globally, in terms of economic, and absolute economic security, it's better than it's ever been by a huge margin for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So there's a much smaller proportion of people who are without food and water and sanitary facilities, technology and education, and immunization and healthcare and basic living standard. And and that's a huge amount of that's developed in the last 30 years. And almost all of it is developed in the last 150, despite the fact that the population has exploded to a tremendous degree. And so from the perspective of absolute privation, things are better than they ever have been. In the West, well, that's hard to say too, isn't it? I mean, there's all sorts of opportunities that there weren't. The technological explosion has produced a tremendous increment in wealth in some ways. I mean, you have more computational power in your phone than NASA used to send people to the moon and back, and it's basically free. Now, it's not free, but fundamentally, the cost has plummeted to such a degree that and we have this tremendous communications technology. There's a kind of instability, I think, that wasn't there 20 years ago. And I think it's a consequence of rapid technological change. It seems to me, and that's possibly because I'm old,